Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I changed my title. So I'll be talking about taking us out to the coast, where I'm going to talk about some work that we've been doing in tidal wetlands on the Pacific coast of the US. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors on two projects that I'm going to talk about today from the University of Oregon and the Institute for Applied Ecology. Next slide. So tidal wetlands are important for a lot of different ecosystem services that humans and wildlife species value. They're very important in supporting fish and various wildlife species, especially salmonids, which utilize tidal wetlands in their migration from freshwater to ocean environments. Tidal wetlands buffer coastlines from storms and flooding. We see this especially when hurricanes or tsunamis land, that areas that have intact tidal wetlands have much less damage than well-developed estuaries. Tidal wetlands are also important to, they're home to unique species, including a number of threatened or endemic species that only live in these kinds of environments. And finally, a value of increasing importance recently is their ability to sequester and store really high levels of organic carbon. This is what we call blue carbon. And these storage levels can exceed forested ecosystems, including tropical rainforests and very productive temperate rainforests. Next slide. There are a variety of different tidal wetland types in the Pacific Northwest. These include lower elevation wetlands, known as tide flats or seagrass meadows in the lower intertidal zone. And then in the upper intertidal zone, they tend to encompass tidal marshes and tidal swamps. And I'll be talking mostly today about tidal marshes due to a focus on one of our national park sites in the Northwest. Next slide. So two key terms that I will be mentioning relative to these projects, and I want to just sort of define right off the bat, are restoration and blue carbon. So restoration generally is any kind of habitat enhancement that goes on. And in tidal wetlands, this usually involves the removal of any kind of obstruction that affects tidal flows, regular tidal inundation by the estuary. Historically, many levees have been put up over tidal wetlands to reclaim them for agriculture or urban development. And so removing these levees restores that tidal influence. About 85% of our tidal wetlands along the West Coast have been lost due to the building of these levees. And then the other term I want to define is blue carbon, which I mentioned a little bit already, but this is the organic matter, particularly organic carbon, that is stored long-term in tidal wetland soils and biomass. And blue carbon is sort of undergoing renewed interest lately because of its potential to be a natural climate solution that could supplement the needed emissions reductions that society takes. This map just shows a number of kind of recent projects that we've been involved with, both in terms of restoration and blue carbon along the West Coast. Next slide. So the two projects I'm going to talk about today they were much more widespread geographically, but they were both conducted in part in Lewis and Clark National Historical Park. And this is a small National Park Service site that includes both state parks and NPS lands in the lower Columbia River estuary. So the Columbia River is one of the three largest estuaries on the Pacific coast of the US. And it's a very river-dominated, very fresh estuary overall. And the Lewis and Clark River on the Oregon side of the Columbia River is one of the main tributaries of the lower Columbia. And we conducted our work at three different sites. So one we're terming MLC. This was the mouth of the Lewis and Clark River. This is Port of Astoria land that served as a reference site for, it was a least disturbed reference site for our projects. And then two restoration sites we looked at, NRF and SCS, are restored project sites that are within Park Service boundaries. Next slide. This is just a photograph of the Lewis and Clark River that you can see from the National Park Service site. Beautiful in the summer. Next slide. And the first project I'm going to talk about is a project that we've been doing with a number of partners, academic and then NOAA affiliated partners along the West Coast. And this is to look at the conditions in mature restoration projects on our coastline. For this project, we really wanted to focus on older restoration sites that were at least 20 years old. Some of them span to the 60-year range, for including this site on the Lewis and Clark River. And the goal was really to understand the long-term trajectory of restoration, what's working and what's not working. This was a West Coast-wide assessment, so you can see the list of all the sites that we've been working at over the last year and a half, spanning from San Diego to Washington. But we chose the Lewis and Clark River site, because it was one of the oldest sites on the West Coast, and it provided a kind of a low salinity end member for this project. Next slide. So our methods involved looking at a couple of different wetland parameters. We would have liked to have looked at more, but we were sort of time limited because we had such a large geography to cover. But we focused on three main parameters. The first was wetland surface elevation. The next was vegetation characteristics, so cover, composition, and species richness. And then third was blue carbon stocks and sequestration. So for the lower Columbia River estuary, Lewis and Clark River, we compared each historic reference site or stored site with a nearby least disturbed reference wetland. So we have the National Park Service site as our historic restored site, and then the nearby MLC site as our reference wetland. We did, for plant cover, composition, and diversity, we used standardized quadrats along transects. For elevation, we used RTK, GN, and GPS, which allows very high accuracy measurement of the vertical surface of the wetlands. And then for carbon stocks and sequestration, we took soil cores, segmented those cores into vertically, and then developed profiles of carbon and then accretion rates. Next slide. So these are the results for wetland elevation. And one of the reasons we care about wetland elevation is that tidal wetlands are susceptible to sea level rise. So sea level rise is ongoing currently, and we believe that it's also accelerating with climate change. So if wetlands are higher in the tidal frame, they're likely to have more resilience to sea level rise. So on this figure here, we have a standardized tidal elevation. This just scales the elevation to the local tide range of a particular site. And the three box plots on the left show the Lewis and Clark River sites. We have our young restored site in light blue, the old restored site in teal, and then the reference site in gray. And then the two box plots on the right kind of show all of the sites that were restored simply by levee removal along the Pacific coast. So our young restored site is sort of expected, had lower elevation than the reference or the older site. And the older site actually surprisingly had higher elevation than our reference wetland. So this is suggesting that for these Lewis and Clark River sites, that they're fairly high enough in the tidal frame to have at least moderate sea level rise resilience. When we looked at the study across the entire Pacific coast, our restored and reference wetlands really had a wide range of elevations. So some of the older restored sites were doing quite well, had relatively high elevations. Others were not doing well, and they may be lacking sediment supply or other factors that make them less resilient to sea level rise. Next slide. These are some preliminary results for the vegetation communities, which we're just working up right now. We found that macroalgae were not present at all in either the restored or reference sites on the Lewis and Clark River. And this was different from other sites along the West Coast where macroalgae can be more important as a component of these vegetation communities. The left figure shows total plant cover in the restored and reference wetlands, and overall cover was relatively high. So we can have greater than 100% cover when we have layering of different species in the canopy. And then we also found that the restored site had higher non-native species cover. So this wasn't exactly a surprise, but sometimes we have more non-native species in these disturbed restored sites. Next slide. This shows the results for plant diversity. We actually found slightly higher species richness in our restored site than in the reference wetland. And this was somewhat of a surprise. And when we looked cumulatively across the site at all the quadrats that we sampled, we found about equal species richness in both of the sites. At some of our other project sites on the West Coast, we did find that restored richness was lower than reference site richness. So this suggests that these restoration sites are taking a very long time to fully recover their plant diversity. And we sometimes found that restored sites also lack some of the rare species that might be found in reference wetlands. Next slide. I think I'll skip this for sake of time. Next slide. So the second project we did was to look at greenhouse gas emissions in Pacific Northwest estuaries. The goal here was really to assess emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. These are two very powerful greenhouse gases that can offset the climate benefits of carbon sequestration. These are the project partners, and we worked at 6 different estuaries in Oregon and Washington, including the Lewis and Clark River, to look at this question. Next slide. We measured flux measurements of these gases and as well as CO2 using portable gas analyzer and chambers that we brought into the field. And we also made simultaneous measurements of wetland elevation, groundwater conditions, including temperature, salinity, and groundwater level. And these show sort of annual time series of groundwater conditions at our restored and reference site in the Lewis and Clark River. Next slide. And then we put all of these data, not just the Lewis and Clark site, but all of these Pacific Northwest sites into a single model, a nonlinear multivariate model. And this gave us information on the relative importance of different environmental drivers of these data. And the take home here is that elevation, salinity, and water table were the 3 most important variables. Next slide. And then finally, just to show some results, these are results of our integrated methane emissions for over an annual cycle. On the y-axis, we have the log of methane emissions, and then the 2 x-axes are mean annual salinity and mean elevation. So interestingly, our restored site in the Lewis and Clark River actually had the highest methane emissions of all the sites in the entire project. And we think that this is because there's a confluence of relatively low elevation, relatively low salinity, which favors methane production, and relatively high water tables. Our reference wetland had considerably lower methane fluxes. We do think that methane production in the wetland probably will decrease over time. So as the site matures and it gains elevation, and as hydrology changes in the restoring wetland, most likely methane emissions will decrease. Next slide. And just some take-home messages across the West Coast. We found that the condition of these older restoration sites was very site-specific. Some had good sea level rise resiliency, others not so good. Most looked pretty good in terms of their vegetation composition, but often they had less diversity than reference wetlands. And finally, we found that methane emissions were highly variable, but there are probably local factors and perhaps management interventions that can help reduce methane emissions. Great, well, thank you.
Alrighty, thank you, Chris. Looks like there was one question in the chat from Robert, DFW. What about native species richness among wetland types?
Yeah, so we, for this project specifically, we've mainly looked at emergent marshes. We do find really high species richness when we look at tidal forests. So these are a rare ecosystem type in the Pacific Northwest, not really found in California, but these are often dominated by Sitka spruce or willows, and they are tidal and they can tolerate a modest amount of salt. And both woody species and herbaceous species diversity can be really high in these ecosystems, but they're understudied. Most of them have been lost or destroyed, so they're kind of an ongoing area of research.
And real quick, we'll just get the second question, and we have a little bit of extra time on this session today. So any ideas why microalgae were missing from Lewis and Clark sites?
So microalgae were probably present. We didn't specifically look at microalgae in this project. The macroalgae, sort of the visibly distinct, sea lettuce and other things, were missing. It may have to do with nutrient levels. So there may be some sites where nutrients are more important. We didn't measure that, unfortunately, just for lack of time, but those nutrient levels could lead to algal blooms. Algae can respond very, very rapidly to nutrient input. So that's one possibility.
Okay. If there's any other questions, feel free to leave them for Chris, and Chris, you could answer them in the chat. We're going to move on, though, to the next speaker.